Well, hello, and welcome back to Stories by Will. I am your host, Will, and we're going to continue today reading stories from Tales Told in Holland. Now, the chapter that we're getting into has actually several stories in it. I counted two or three, and this one is a little bit longer. So I'm going to break this one up into separate streams. So the next story that we run into, I'll label it as 20 1, then 20 2, then 20 3. And then if we hit the next chapter, that'll be 24 just for consistency and numbering of the stories going through the book. So the chapter of this one is called Great Days in Holland. And before I get started, I'm going to do the YouTube Rumble thing. And please like and subscribe. And if you like the stories, please share it with friends and family that you think might enjoy stories as well. Um, I have the banners going below if you want to support the channel a little bit more. It's always appreciated. And thank you to all the subscribers that we do currently have. I appreciate you sticking it out with me over the past year or two. And we're going to try to keep growing the channel here as we move forward. I'm sorry, I keep moving around. My sinuses are kind of bothering me. So today's story is The King of Smiles, Franz Hall, 1580 through 1666. So, in Haarlem, on the street called Pieserleestag, Steg, Pieserleersteg, lived one Franz Hals, a painter of portraits, with his wife, Lisbeth. They were a jolly couple. They laughed in the morning, they laughed at noon, they laughed at night. Indeed, they loved nothing better than laughter. One fine afternoon, Franz put on his wide brimmed black beaver hat and went for a stroll about Haarlem, passing the time of day in genial fashion with the burghers of his acquaintance. Along the banks of the Sparn, with its jumble of boats, he wandered, through the great square with the old town hall, and past the tall masses of the Groot Kirk. Ah, the Dutch in those days were proud and happy folk. They walked with swagger in their silks and ruffs and fine laces. They had fought long fight for freedom and won. They had signed the beard of the King of Spain and driven the Spaniards out of their land. Their vessels sailed the seven seas. Their sturdy adventurers roamed afar, discovering lands before unknown. And, to crown their glory, a series of brilliant painters had suddenly appeared to startle the world with the beauty of their pictures. As Franz walked the streets of Haarlem, he greeted many a fellow member of the civic guard, or dropped into some stately old guild hall where the guardsmen met, as in little clubs, to hold shooting contests or banquets. And it chanced that the officers of the Guild of St. George began to say, "It is long enough that we have seen kings and dukes and counts looking down at us from their portraits on our guild house walls. Let us put the kings and the dukes in the cellar and have our own faces painted and hung in the places of honor." So the officers sent for Franz Hals at the time of their yearly banquet. He came to the guild hall as they sat around the table with the last of the food still before them. There they sat, 12 in number, with ruffs about their necks, all dressed in dark colored clothes, relieved, relieved by scarlet silk sashes. Can't speak today very well. Middle aged men they were, full bearded and mustached, save for two dandy standard bearers who were little more than use. And the colonel, Peter Schultz Jacobson, a stout old fellow, who was sitting with his back to Franz, turned around with his right arm akimbo, and quoth, with a genial smile, I'm sorry, give me a second. My co host wants to run outside real quick. Sorry about that. We would have you paint our portraits, Franz Hall, to hang on the guild house walls. Then Franz set to work, in good earnest, and painted the officers just as he had seen them, bold and laughing around the table, a genial, masterful group. And no sooner had the good folk of Haarlem beheld the finished picture with its figures all so lifelike that the officers, all of the other shooting guilds in Haarlem, wished to follow suit and have their pictures painted likewise. Soon, an endless procession of sitters began to besiege Franz's studio, demanding to have their portraits. And, and Herman and Sarah and Jan and Franz and the rest of the little houses, peeping through the curtains of their father's sanctum, saw a wondrous array of bold dress menhirs and Mevros, Mevros sitting before his easel. There was Mevro van Berestein in a velvet brocade with a gold embroidered stomacher sticking out stiffly a mile in front of her. There was Mynheer van Huihuizen with an excellently good conceit of himself, his left arm on his hip, his right arm extended to the rest of his magnificent, magnificent sword on the ground, and his head, in his white beaver hat, held high in the air as one who would say, and what do you think of me? And that's what I'd like to know. Often it happened, too, that the full dress menhirs and mevrouws brought with them to Franz's studio exceedingly full dressed children who wiggled and squirmed in their satins and laces, and would far rather have played than have their honor of being painted. Indeed, they could not keep out of mischief, but played all sorts of hijinks, in spite of their costly finery, and made monkey faces at any small halls whose bright eyes might chance to appear through the opening of the curtains. Ah, those were the happy days. Days when the little houses had plenty of money to spend on heat, koken, and sweetmeats, for these burghers had paid Franz good guilders, a generous price for their pictures. One day, Bra Halls, the jolly Lisbeth, said to her good man Franz, Franz, you are getting famous painting other husbands and wives. Why don't you paint yourself and me, pray tell? And she put on her best Sunday go to meeting dress, a black brocade with its stylish purple bodice, and went to the expense of the newest things in ruffs and cuffs and caps. Then she made Franz don his town hall suit of black silk and brocade, his best beaver hat, his cambric cuffs, and his collar of fine Michelin lace. Sitting down beside him on the bench, she put her husband, she put on her hand, she put her hand on his shoulder and said, Now, Franz, paint us like this. But as she sat there, desiring to look so impressive, like a sober and dignified matron, Franz told her a funny story. A story so funny that she could not keep her face straight. She laughed and laughed and laughed. Franz, the rascal, painted her just like that. Trying to straighten her face was a tremble with laughter. And there in the picture on the halls of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, they sit to this very day, in the garden green beneath the shady tree, with a sunny vision of fountains and marble pavilions beyond. The Franz, for all his success, began to come in for a great deal of trouble in painting his huge group pictures of officers of the guilds. Captain Vischer will come with his lordliest swagger to interrupt the artist's work and say that Captain Vanderveen was standing in front of him and shutting him out of the picture. And since he was paying the same amount as his friend for the honor of having his portrait painted, he must demand that his own figure be brought forward where it could be seen to the best advantages. Or Captain de Herbst would drop in to twirl his mustache and say that he noticed he was being painted so that only three-quarters of his face was turned to the front, and he must really insist most positive most positively on having his full face shown. Such bickerings and corrections. There must be not but a row of figures, all equally large, all turned full face to the front. What a problem for an artist whose artist's soul demanded for some figures to be in the background and some in the front. With a variety of positions, at least Franz settled the question once and for all. He would paint no more portraits in rows, but, and here, once for all, he would paint no more, and here he showed his cleverness. Those who paid the most should have places of honor. Henceforth, the colonel, who was generally one of the wealthiest members of the guild, had to bid up and pay a very high fee to become the most conspicuous figure. Captains paid for second place, lieutenants for third, and sergeants must needs be content with peeping out from the rear. It was a troublesome business at best. Painting these worthy burghers, what Franz really loved was laughter. He liked to wander away from the respectable patrons of his studio to the bustling fish market and search for more picturesque subjects. Fishwives carrying their wares, queer old sailormen, tavern heroes with mug or flute or violi, saucy young market lassies boldly passing him with a quick flung joke or jib. He joined in the rollicking company at kermesses and fairs in the country round about. He played hijinks with everyone who would laugh, and a series of jovial couples and merry groups danced off his palette, the merriest of figures. Their mouths laughed, their eyes laughed, their noses laughed, their cheeks laughed. What do they care for but pranks and frolics? Down by the sea, among the sand dunes, which rise high as little hills along the coast near Haarlem, Franz met fisher lads and lassies, strong and blithe of build, full of life's gaiety. Scores of these he painted. Indeed, He painted so many dirty urchins and beggar children that people began. Sorry, I had a internet thing there. So to prove that he was not entirely lost his love for what was fine, he painted the infant son of a wealthy tulip grower of Haarlem, an elegant little rascal, in the arms of his good-natured nurse. The dress of the child is a splendid piece of gold brocade, with the lace so carefully painted it seems as though Franz must have cut off a length of the rare Michelin point and pasted it on the canvas. But in spite of his finery, the tiny imp has a mischievous smile as he seizes the brooch at his nurse's neck. Now, at this time, Franz had living with him, besides his own lively children, several young lads who were learning to paint. Among these apprentices were that monkey, Adrian Brouwer, and his brothers, Adrian Isaac van Ostade. Adrian van Ostade painted peasants merrymaking, and Isaac, getting some computer issues here, I'm sorry. Isaac painted winter scenes, frozen canals with skaters and sledges on ice. These rascals loved laughter with all as well as Franz. Sometimes they painted on the sidewalks bits of money, tempting pieces of gold or silver. Then they hid themselves to watch how passersby would try to pick up the treasure. So carefully they had done their paintings, so true in each detail, that scarcely a man or woman came by who did not stoop down and try in vain to pick up the painted coins. Between the years 1630 and 1640, Franz was recognized as the foremost painter of Holland. To Har- of Holland, to Haarlem, as to artist Mecca, as to an artist Mecca, flocked teachers and students from every land. Now in those days, Frederick Henry of Nassau, Prince of Orange, and the son of William the Silent, had succeeded his brother Maurice as standholder of the Netherlands. Under Frederick Henry, the Dutch finally defeated the Spaniards and drove them from every corner of their land. At such a pitch of power and glory, Frederick Henry summoned Anthony van Dyck of Antwerp, a Flemish artist, to Holland to paint his family portrait. Van Dyck, who had studied under the great Flemish master Rubens, had been for the past 10 years court painter of James I of England. Having finished his work for the standholder, and being on the point of embarking again for England, Van Dyck wished to see for himself Frans Hals, the master about whom gossiped. Sorry, not sure what my computer is doing. Let me. Van Dyck wished to see for himself Frans Hals, the master about whom gossip had spun such wonderful stories. One bright morning in June 1630, Van Dyck knocked on Franz's front door. Frau Hals greeted the stranger politely, though he did not tell her his name. My husband is not at home, she said, but she sent her son Jan to look around for his father. Jan found Franz in a little back room of a tavern. There's a smart gentleman all the way from The Hague to see you, said the lad. and he wants you to paint his portrait. Franz left the retreat in bad humor. It's the dickens of a nuisance to be interrupted, he scolded, and he welcomed the stranger coolly. But Van Dyke, never telling his name, offered him a tempting fee if he would paint his portrait. Picking up an old canvas from the floor, Franz began to lay on the paint with unwilling but masterful hand, and in a couple of hours he had completed such a likeness that his visitor was delighted. Now, said Van Dyke, I beg one more favor. Let me, in return, paint you. Franz opened his eyes in amazement, but he seated himself in the model's chair, and as the stranger progressed in his work, he grew more and more astounded. Why, he cried, there is but one man in the world who could paint such a portrait. You must be Anthony Van Dyke. Now, Van Dyck had been summoned to England by Charles I to paint himself and his court, and he eagerly urged Franz to go with him across the channel. But no inducements whatsoever would move Franz from Holland. Holland was his world. Dutch of the Dutch was Franz. So Van Dyck sailed off for England alone, and Franz went back to his pots. After year after year passed by, till the pots became too much for him. Sorry, my co-host is right here on the site. He might make an appearance yet. Love of laughter and junketing, championing with tavern heroes, made a drunkard of Franz. He began to grow lazy and shiftless. No fine procession of menhirs or mebrows came now to his studio. He painted little, and poverty began to look in at the windows of the house on Pieserleersteg. There, no extra pennies for the heat koken and goodies. But Lisbeth did not chide him. Whatever her good man did, she never scolded. Her love was warm and tender, in spite of his faults. They still continued to smile and laugh together. So at 70, Franz, delighted, as he had in the early years, to wander off to the market. But his friends were no longer lads and lassies. He hobnobbed now with few ancient cronies. One old lady in particular took his fancy. She was ugly as a scarecrow, but the striking play of her features and the wrinkles of her leathery skin fascinated Franz. The men called her Hillybob, and she lived in a hovel by the fish market. She used her tongue and let every man know what she thought of him and his. And if he happened to displease her, Franz painted her once. Franz painted her once, holding a tankard with an owl perched on her shoulder, and her mouth open as though she were screeching shrilly her opinions at some interlopers. And now the color of Franz's palette grew dark and dull and gray. His pictures were full of shadows, and so was his life. Poorer and poorer he grew. Shabbier and shabbier grew the house on Pisolerste. One after another, his good bits of furniture had to be sold. The place looked sadly down at the heels, pathetic, ragged, and seedy. Then certain old chums of Franz, who were on the board of the Old Women's Almshouse in Harlem, met in solemn conclave and agreed to mission the aged master to paint two portrait groups, one of themselves and one of the lady governors of the Old Women's Home. At the age of 84, Franz painted these two groups. They were not distinguished for youth or beauty, or swaggering with conscious power like his early soldier groups. But the old ladies, in particular, were attractive in their sternness, in their garments as plain as their person, but their faces alight with interest, eager, intelligent, and bright. And so the last days of Franz, thanks to his loyal friends, were busy and happy, with work well repaid. And Lisbeth, his lifelong comrade, still smiling by his side. And that brings us to the end of the first story. The next story will be about Jan Steen, Steen. So if you happen to pick up any morals or values out of this story, I would love to hear comments. If you could drop them in the comment right below, I'd really appreciate that. Again, please, if you're watching this, like and subscribe, share it out with your family members. Help me grow my channel a little bit more. Thank you to all my current members, my subscribers. I appreciate you hanging out there with me. And we'll bring this one to a close. Have a wonderful evening. Have a good night.